mean for each of us? Are we convinced that freedom is guaranteed in every aspect of our lives? Or are we forgetting the sacrifices made by those who came before us in order for us to have it? From the times of antiquity until now, the role that freedom played in people's lives changed many times. But in the 18th century, it took on a whole new dimension. In ancient times, man considered freedom to be the possibility to know the truth with his own mind. But with the advent of Christianity, freedom referred to the free will to act or not to act according to God's morals. Throughout this period, individual freedoms were the privilege of the few, until the awareness of collective freedom emerged in the 18th century. This was after the French Revolution that awoke national consciousness across Europe. This powerful movement permanently changed the borders of feudal Europe, as well as the consciousness of its inhabitants over the next 2 centuries. The Italian city of Turin, the capital of Piedmont. It's certainly a breathtaking tourist destination, but many people aren't aware that the Italy we know today was formed thanks to a movement that started from right here, the Kingdom of Piedmont. The King of Piedmont and Sardinia, Victor Emmanuel II, launched a series of political initiatives to unite the small states on the Apennine Peninsula. He succeeded in 1865 by proclaiming the Kingdom of Italy. An identical example in the same period was the unification of Germany, which was led by the Kingdom of Prussia. These movements formed the world in which we live, and they owe their success not only to the political capabilities of rulers, but also to the consciousness that individuals share cultural, linguistic, and often religious identities with others. And they know that collective freedom in a society is best guaranteed through the institution of a nation-state. Aided by the Romantic movement, the vision of the state as the only guarantor of preserving the authenticity of a nation spread through Europe. It saw collective liberation as the only means of national existence. And how is freedom manifested in the 21st century? According to the 2013 census, 12 Klingons and as many as 76 Jedi live in today's Bosnia and Herzegovina. Certain media outlets are increasingly promoting the flat earth theory or are discussing the possibility of an alien invasion under the pretext that everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This creates the danger of freedom being perceived as limitless or becoming a triviality. Freedom without limits means that justice becomes the advantage of the stronger. Monuments such as this speak of the rebellion against such an advantage. And those who rebelled certainly had a spiritual understanding of freedom. The Kozara Memorial was erected in memory of more than 30,000 civilian victims of this part of Republika Srpska in the fight against fascist occupiers during World War II. There are several monuments across the Republika Srpska for those who died in the struggle for freedom. Nothing's infinite, not even freedom. But freedom's value doesn't lie in its infinity, but rather in its ability to preserve unique and authentic characteristics. To that extent, the Republika Srpska is an example that a nation can preserve its identity only if it's free to organize its life.
Republika Srpska za mene predstavlja jednu teritoriju na kojoj se brani jedna kultura od majorizacije. Ta kultura u svakom pogledu zaslužuje da opstane, ona ima svoj jezik, ona ima svoje pismo, ona ima svoju literaturu i ona ima svoj kulturni kod.
Republika Srpska, an entity of the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina in southeast Europe, was created after the disintegration of the socialist Yugoslavia and is largely inhabited by Serbs. Following the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina between 1992 and 1995, the Dayton Peace Agreement shaped the country as a unique federation. Republika Srpska isn't an internationally recognized country, but it has administrative powers to preserve the tradition, identity, and culture of its nation. For Serbs, a turbulent history, rough geographical position, and strong awareness of belonging made the creation of a state not a precondition as it was for Italy and Germany, but rather a consequence of a firm national identity in which freedom is its ultimate value. O boundless, O endless, infinite freedom, come already and visit my country. because everything is nothing without you, nothing is everything with you. These words, written by Petar Kocic, a Serbian poet from the 19th century, speak of the value of freedom in the consciousness of Serbs. And the best example of how this nation sees freedom today is the Republika Srpska, which emerged as a consequence of the belief that freedom really is everything. In 1984, Sarajevo was the host city of the Winter Olympic Games. It sparked the development of winter tourism in the region, embodied in the now popular ski resort on Jahorina, just a snowball's throw from Sarajevo itself. The Games also provided a unique opportunity for socialist Yugoslavia to present itself to the world, as well as its federal republic with an intriguing past, Bosnia and Herzegovina. The archaeological sites in the Republika Srpska are a testimony of the continuity of life here since the Stone Age. Near the town of Sokolac, we can find one of the more significant archaeological sites, that of the Glasinac culture, which can be traced back from the early Bronze Age to the early Iron Age, with its peak around the 4th century BC. In the time of antiquity, tribes that were inertly called Illyrians left their mark here, until the arrival of the Roman Empire, which conquered the Illyrian tribes. During the Middle Ages, Christianity spread in these parts and gained full momentum, as evidenced by the Stetak tombstones as medieval monuments, which speak of class affiliation and mostly testify to the Christian rite originating from Byzantium. More than 1,000 athletes from as many as 49 countries competed at the Sarajevo Olympics, while more than 4,000 journalists reported on the Games. However, twists and turns of the competing athletes certainly weren't the only thing spectators could see. The Church of the Holy Archangel Michael is popularly known as the Old Orthodox Church in Basčaršija, and it was built around the 14th century. The turbulent history has taken its toll on this building, which is one of the oldest religious buildings in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It was burned several times throughout history until it was finally restored at the end of the 18th century. Not far from the old church, we see one of the most magnificent buildings in all of Sarajevo, the Orthodox Cathedral Church of the Nativity of Theotokos. The construction, which lasted more than a decade, was completed in 1874 with the consecration of the Bishop of Dobro Bosnia, Paisius. The church was built exclusively through donations from the faithful and represents the symbolic contribution of the Serbian people to the architecture of Sarajevo, which has its foundation in medieval Bosnia that started developing around the source of the river Bosna. After the 10th century, Bosnia, like other Serbian states, started developing independently, with the state of Raška, under the Nemanjić dynasty, soon becoming dominant among them. Bosnia was originally ruled by Bans, with the most prominent and notable historic ruler being Ban Kulin, who embodied the so-called Bosnian age of peace and prosperity. The 13th century ushered in the rule of the Kotromanić dynasty. The most important ruler of this dynasty, Stefan Tvrtko Kotromanić I, was the king of the Kingdom of Serbs and Bosnia and tried to unite the two medieval states of Bosnia and Raška. The 15th century witnessed the foundation of Herzegovina, a territory named after the title of Herceg of Saint Sava, the first Serbian archbishop from the Nemanjić dynasty, which gave the Nemanjić seal to the state of Bosnia and Herzegovina, something that remains to this day. The Kotromanić dynasty ruled Bosnia for almost 2 centuries. Now, the rise of the state of Bosnia was slowed down by the death of Tvrtko Kotromanić I, which led to dynastic power struggles. At the end of the 15th century, Bosnia fell under the rule of the Ottoman Empire, which was dominated by Islam, and remained in this area until the Congress of Berlin in the late 19th century. More than 200,000 tickets were sold for the Olympics, and around 2 billion people watched the live broadcast. It must have been interesting for them to see scenes of a typically Oriental city, only to then cut to scenes of typical Central European architecture. At the beginning of the 19th century, an uprising against the Ottomans in Serbia led to the creation of the Principality of Serbia. This was an incentive for the Serbs in Herzegovina to rebel against the Ottoman occupier in 1875. Their success was without reward, because Bosnia and Herzegovina was quickly occupied by Austria-Hungary, which ruled this area until the end of World War I. It was from here, Schönbrunn Palace, that the Habsburg dynasty ruled the Austrian Empire. Now, the dynasty ruled for more than 600 years, and the internal stability of the empire often depended on encouraging hostilities between the many nations that were part of it. Bosnia and Herzegovina can certainly be used as an example of Austro-Hungarian policy towards the occupied nations. As Serbs constituted the majority in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the occupation and had a strong desire to unite all South Slavs, they were considered hostile by the Austrians. The second largest group, Muslims, didn't have a clear national identity, but the Austro-Hungarian authorities encouraged a new, national consciousness in an attempt to exploit them as a counterbalance to Serbs. Croats, who were Catholic, were the smallest in number of the 3 major nations in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but because of their religious affiliation, they were favoured by Austria-Hungary at the expense of the other 2 nations. Sounds complicated, doesn't it? And this game of playing favourites can be seen in the architecture as well. During the Austro-Hungarian occupation, the magnificent Catholic Cathedral of the Sacred Heart of Jesus was built in Sarajevo, a Catholic school in Travnik and other cities, as well as in specific infrastructural, cultural and economic projects. Every war needs a pretext. The political elites who start wars motivated by their own self-interests always seek out an event to justify the reason given for such a disastrous phenomenon. One such event happened because of a boyish faith in humane ideals, right at this spot in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, a member of the Young Bosnia organisation, Gavrilo Princip, shot the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, killing him and his wife. In Vienna, this act inflamed the already hostile attitude towards Serbia, with Austria-Hungary soon declaring a full-blown war. It is interesting that an almost identical assassination on an Austro-Hungarian princess, which was carried out by an Italian in 1898, wasn't used as a pretext for war. Austria-Hungary wanted to expand its empire to the east. And I know this sounds gruesome, but the assassination in Sarajevo served as an excellent excuse for that. However, the result was not what Austria-Hungary had hoped for. The conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia turned into World War I, which ended with the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that started it, and the formation of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes, which later changed its name to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, that existed up until World War II. It was here that Meša Selimovic's words were most evident. Selimovic, who was born a Bosnian Muslim but traced back his Serbian roots, said man becomes free by choice, resistance and disobedience. In 1941, demonstrators gathered here in Serbia's capital Belgrade to protest any form of alliance with Nazi Germany, the largest military force of the 20th century, significantly more powerful than the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Despite the Kingdom of Yugoslavia securing a non-aggression pact, the Serbian people cried out, "Better a grave than a slave." Following the people's uprising, Hitler invaded Yugoslavia in April 1941. The disastrous bombing of major cities in Serbia marked the beginning of the occupation. The first thing Hitler demanded from occupied Yugoslavia was to bring him the plaque that marked the spot where Gavrilo Princip shot and killed Archduke Ferdinand. the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was divided into occupation zones by fascist and Nazi forces. The liberation of Belgrade in 1944 marked the victory of the communist-led partisans and led to a change in the political system of Yugoslavia. In 1945, the socialist Yugoslavia was formed, whose first and lifelong president was Josip Broz Tito. Tito became known worldwide in 1948 for rejecting the Soviets in their attempts to control Yugoslavia, and later initiating the creation of the non-aligned movement. The countries that made up this movement didn't want to take part in the Cold War era division of the world and sought a third way in international relations. Despite being held 4 years after Tito's death, the Sarajevo Olympics remained the only Olympic Games held in a country that was a member of the non-aligned movement. Yugoslavia was organised on a federal principle with 6 republics: Serbia, Slovenia, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. You're listening to something called a Sevdalinka, a song authentic to the area of Bosnia and Herzegovina. However, it could always be heard throughout Serbia and other republics, which speaks of the influence of culture from this area throughout Yugoslavia. The people in Yugoslavia also listened to another type of music from Sarajevo, like songs of Bijelo Dugme. In the 1970s, a rock band from Sarajevo named Bijelo Dugme held the biggest rock concert in Yugoslavia's history, right here in the country's capital, Belgrade. The youth of many Yugoslavs was marked by other rock bands from Sarajevo, such as Indeksi, Zabranjeno pušenje, or Crvena jabuka. Rock bands aside, many ordinary citizens who contributed to the state through their hard work were also popular. They were placed on banknotes of Yugoslavia's national currency, the dinar. And the most famous were Alija Sirotanovic and Arif Heralic, who were from Bosnia and Herzegovina. The two were known as udarniks, or shock workers. Udarniks were highly productive workers known for their super productive, enthusiastic labour and incredible results. This award promoted economic development that was evident in Bosnia and Herzegovina. After Tito's death in 1980, Yugoslavia somewhat opened up to criticism of social problems. The top list of the Surrealists started airing a radio comedy segment in the early 1980s, later becoming a sketch comedy and variety television show which aired on Sarajevo TV and to an extent on Yugoslav radio television. The show's sketches discussed social issues in a satirical manner, often predicting events to come. In criticising the extensive bureaucratic apparatus, the Surrealists filmed a sketch in which government officials and politicians staged a strike because industrial workers were demanding their paychecks and the citizens constantly had their own requests. The already seriously deteriorated financial status of the citizens was presented satirically in the show Prize Robbery, in which citizens participated in a game in which they were deprived of their property.
Njima ćemo, kao što znate, oteti sada televizor. Nadam se da su sretni gubitnici tu kod kuće. Vidim televizore marke Hyundai iz Južne Koreje.
At the beginning of the 1990s, as ethnic tensions were rising, the Surrealists staged a fake news program declaring that Bosnia and Herzegovina is threatened by an outbreak of peace. Humour through satire as a way of dealing with problems and shortcomings remains present to this day in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But in addition to this phenomenon, there are hidden dangers for the uninformed visitor. Here you have to be very careful. For example, when it comes to food, especially when it comes to a specialty, burek. If you accidentally order, burek sa sirom. Možda sa krompirom? Neki krem?
Burek je s mesom.
The cuisine of this area is characterised by the dynamics of mixing cultures, so the dishes are very colourful and delicious thanks to the spices that come from the Orient. Every visitor has to try the Bosnian pot, tufahija, baklava, sogan dolma, cevapi, and many other dishes. However, I definitely first recommend you try burek. The dough, made using old techniques with a delicious filling, is something most people here consume every day. and it's something that holds a special place in the hearts of all who live in Bosnia and Herzegovina. After Jure Franko won the first ever Winter Olympics medal for Yugoslavia at the Games in Sarajevo, Franko was celebrated with the slogan, "I love Jurek more than Burek." However, the mix of cultures wasn't evident in just the food, but also in the political system of the socialist Bosnia and Herzegovina, inhabited by its constituent nations Serbs, Croats and Muslims. Maybe you're confused why we're talking about Muslims as a nation when you know that Muslims are a religious group, which is different from an ethnic group. Well, in 1971, the Yugoslav census allowed members of Bosnia and Herzegovina's Muslim religious community to declare themselves as Muslim by ethnicity for the first time.
Onog trenutka kad se neko proglasi nacijom, on postaje kao i u lingvistici, politička nacija. A politička nacija kad uzme svoje vrijeme, ona naravno ne mari za prošlošću.
The historical genesis can be traced back to the Balkan conquest of the Ottoman Empire, which was predominantly Muslim. In 1971, many identified their ethnicity as Muslim, while as of 1993, they identify as Bosniak. Serbs, Bosniaks and Croats all participated in the creation of Bosnia and Herzegovina's cultural uniqueness. And in the socialist Yugoslavia, the system was devised in such a way that no matter which group was greater in number, they all had an equal opportunity to participate in policymaking. Mostar is a Herzegovinian city named after the guardians of the bridges and bridge builders on the river Neretva, where it's located. And the old bridge is the most recognisable part of the city. The bridge was built during the Ottoman occupation in the 16th century, but it was demolished by Croatian forces during the war in 1993. The spirit of the people who live here is reflected in the black humour joke that, after the demolition, they'll build an even older bridge.
After a war that's destroyed much of the historic city, the task of rebuilding is finally underway.
The rebuilt bridge is called the New Old Bridge, and a specific tradition is connected to it, which speaks of the courage of Herzegovinian young men. And that tradition looks like this. Herzegovinian young men, known for their courage, certainly took the lead in such jumps. But the period after the 1984 Olympics brought new types of confirmation of this characteristic. If you were a young guy during the Sarajevo Olympics, you knew that a Volkswagen Golf worked wonders for your reputation in the city.
Boga mi, malo je ko u ono vrijeme imao Volkswagen Golf, tek se pojavio u Vogošći i ko je imao Golfa, taj je bez problema mogao da smuva djevojku. Ja nisam imao Golfa, sam imao druge vještine, pa sam uvao djevojke. A nije da se hvalim, ali sad 20 godina, onda znaš kako je to izgledalo.
Kakav je bio život momka sa 20 godina u Sarajevu tokom zimskih olimpijskih igara?
Bilo je više nego dobro. Jedna euforija je vladala na ovim prostorima, nevjerojatna. Jedna dobra atmosfera, dobra vibracija, taj duh olimpizma koji se tad buknuo i razvio, dan danas živi kod nas, tih generacija iz tog vremena. Zaista je to bilo nešto neponovljivo. Svi smo se trudili da budemo dobri domaćini, da svoje balkone, dvorišta, zgrade uredimo, fasade, tako dalje. Svi su bili kao jedno u smislu da ispadnemo i budemo dobri domaćini, što nam je i uspjelo.
The expansion of cooperation with the German automaking giant Volkswagen was supposed to be the pinnacle of Bosnia and Herzegovina's economic development. But in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, And the very next year, the 14th Congress of the Communist Party in Belgrade saw the delegations of the republics of Slovenia and Croatia leave the party. With Slovenia and Croatia's declarations of independence, the stable rule of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia turned into a civil war in 1991. Thus, at the end of the 20th century, we saw that history didn't leave scars here, but rather open wounds. The dissolution of the Christian Church in 1054 into a Western Catholic Church with its centre in Rome and an Eastern Orthodox Church with its centre in Constantinople brought a millennium of bloody religious wars to the area of Southeast Europe. The understanding of religion as being a reason to go to war appeared as a relic at the end of the 20th century right here around the River Bosna, which was and remains one of the borders of this division. As the central government of the Communist Party was weakening, the major ethnic groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina all founded their national political parties. Although the so-called Croatian Democratic Union, or HDZ, was founded by Franjo Tudjman in early 1990 in Croatia, the HDZ operated in Bosnia and Herzegovina itself, representing the interests of Croats there. In May of 1990, the Islamist Party of Democratic Action, or SDA, was founded by Alija Izetbegović in Bosnia and Herzegovina, representing the interests of Muslims. The Serbs in that republic were the last to form their national party, the Serbian Democratic Party, or SDS, led by Sarajevo psychiatrist Radovan Karadžić, representing the political will of Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina. After the first multi-party elections in the republic, the Muslim SDA took 86 seats, the Serb SDS 72 seats, and the Croat HDZ 45 seats. According to the Constitution, major decisions could not have been made without a consensus reached by all three nations. But the political leaders of the Muslims and Croats decided to ignore this golden rule. It's considered that the creation of modern nations took place at the end of the 18th and 19th century, with the French, German, and Italian nations serving as the best examples. But the Serbian people don't owe their awareness of belonging to the constitution of the state itself, but to their ancient identity. In one of the most important historical writings from the 10th century, the Administrando Imperio, written by Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, he mentions the small land of Bosnia and lists towns there he says are inhabited by Serbs. The Bans, or rulers in Bosnia in the early Middle Ages, were more or less in a vassal position in relation to the powerful Hungary. But the ethnic composition of their land posed no dilemma for them. In his charter from 1249, Ban Matej Ninoslav signed himself as Matej Stefan, reflective of his connection with the Serbian Nemanjić dynasty, as all its members also took the name Stefan. The Ban sees his subjects as Serbs, while Pope Urban III in the Dubrovnik Charter even sees Bosnia itself, ruled by Kulin Ban, as a part of Serbia. 7 centuries ago, right here at the Mileševa Monastery in present-day Serbia, the most important Bosnian ruler, Tvrtko Kotromanić I, was crowned. And with this act, he put a stamp on the identity of the people of Bosnia. Tvrtko Kotromanić I was crowned in front of the relics of the most important Nemanjić, Saint Sava. Tvrtko took the name Stefan, put lilies on his coat of arms, and in his signature called himself the King of the Serbs. These gestures are all typical of the Nemanjić dynasty, which show how the most significant ruler of medieval Bosnia saw himself and his people. This is the flag of Bosnia and Herzegovina that the Bosniaks designed during the war years, and it was official up until 1998. They used the same emblem on the uniform of the Bosniak-dominated army of Bosnia and Herzegovina during the war. This is the flag of Serbia. Look closer. Remarkable resemblance. However, Bosniaks didn't see the lilies as the Nemanjić heritage of Bosnia, which they factually represent, but as its exact antithesis, a negation of Bosnia's own history. The Nemanjić legacy was also denied in the name Herzegovina, despite it originating from the medieval area of Hum, which the founder of the Nemanjić dynasty, Stefan Nemanja, called his homeland, and was ruled by the most prominent members of the Serbian court. To understand this historical ignorance, we have to discuss the Stetok tombstones. Now, we mentioned that they were erected here in the Middle Ages and that Herzegovina has the largest number of them. Just in one town, here in Nevesinje, there are more of these tombstones than in all of central Bosnia. And this site is considered to be the place where the medieval state originated. These medieval tombstones are on UNESCO's list of intangible heritage. In the form of an epitaph, they expressed a certain social status or some peculiarity for the one who was buried there. At the time that the Stetok tombstones were already being built in Bosnia, Bogomilism appeared, an autochthonous response of the people who weren't close to either Orthodox or Catholic Christians. Both churches considered them heretics. Now, some historians claim that the Stetok tombstones were linked to the Bogomils through inscriptions and paintings found on them. And this claim is used by many Bosniaks today to try to present themselves as descendants of the Bogomils and to argue that their genesis can in no way be traced to Serbs or Croats. However, the inscription on a Stetok tombstone doesn't deal with religious affiliation, but rather tries to emphasize social status, while the Bogomils were against anything that is material, including the construction of tombstones. The Tajniče Gospel, a liturgical book written in the 15th century, is one of the most important Cyrillic writings from the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The strong presence of Byzantine rituals and emergence of some of the most important Cyrillic writings demonstrates a formed identity of Serbs in this area in the first centuries of the second millennium.
Ima ta definicija da je narod zajednica vezana istim jezikom. Snaga jedne nacije je zapravo postavljena ne kao što zapadni filozofi moderni govore da je to kao tribalna postavka. Nije, to je posljednja odbrana jedne vrste kulture koja bi trebalo da se uništi.
The worldview of a person living in the Middle Ages was largely defined by religion. Depending on which religion you belonged to, you'd be a part of a certain cultural pattern. Catholics used the Latin language and script, while Orthodox Christians used the Greek language and alphabet. As Serbs accepted Christianity from Byzantium in the 9th century, but didn't originate from a Greek-speaking area, an authentic script for understanding liturgical books was developed, Cyrillic. The Serbian Cyrillic alphabet remains a feature of Serbian culture to this day, but it was also very present in medieval Bosnia, for example, in the Charter of Kulinban and in Miroslav's Gospel, which is still preserved as one of the most important monuments of Serbian cultural heritage. Criticising democracy, English philosopher Thomas Hobbes argued that in absolutism, power can be abused by one man, while in democracy, it can be abused by many more. Alija Izetbegović, the ideologue, founder and leader of the Party of Democratic Action in the 1990s, was sentenced to 14 years of prison in 1983 in the then socialist Yugoslavia, along with 9 other accomplices for Muslim nationalism and hostile propaganda. 7 years later, the same year when Izetbegović founded his political party, the first edition of his book called The Islamic Declaration was published. In it, he explicitly said that the Islamic movement must take power when it becomes strong enough in numbers, and when it takes over, it should create a new government, which corresponds exclusively to the Islamic worldview. Following what he himself wrote, there is no peace or coexistence between the Islamic faith and non-Islamic social and political institutions. Izetbegović wanted an independent Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the Croats, following the example of neighbouring Croatia, which had already declared independence, also wanted to secede. Taught by their own history, the Serbs saw their survival in a union with Serbia, that is, in Yugoslavia, and they were ready to resolve any disagreements by consensus.
Mi smo donijeli zaključke da se nećemo nadglasavati. Ne vrijedi ni jedna odluka ove skupštine razdora koji može nastati u Bosni i Hercegovini.
But they were duped. After several unsuccessful attempts for a unilateral decision by Muslim and Croat MPs, on October 14th, 1991, as the session of Bosnia and Herzegovina's parliament was ending,
Ovim završavam sjednicu i zahvaljujem se na prisustvu.
Muslim and Croat MPs waited for the Serb MPs to leave, and then, well after midnight, without the presence of Serbs, they adopted the Memorandum of Sovereignty of Bosnia and Herzegovina. making crucial decisions that affect the destinies of millions of people in secret in the wee hours of the night is reminiscent of a Sevdalinka song. A young man criticised by his wise mother, who says that important work isn't done at night. He justifies it by being in love. However, what excuse did the much older MPs have? The October 15th decision was a consequence of a clear desire expressed by Alija Izetbegović in his own words during a parliamentary session of the same year. Quote, I would sacrifice peace for a sovereign Bosnia and Herzegovina. For peace, I would not sacrifice sovereignty. End quote. The message was clear. Decisions would no longer be made by consensus, but rather by outvoting the Serbs, even at the cost of war.
Rat nije nama cilj. Borba bi bila samo sredstvo, ako se od tih ciljeva ne može na drugi način doći.
The Serbs are a nation whose collective memory dates back more than a millennium. And in that memory, the era of the Ottoman occupation is certainly engraved, a time when their rights were extremely endangered.
U vrijeme osmanske vladavine u Bosni i Hercegovini, u tim spahilucima i u tim teritorijama koje su oni pokrivali domaćim vazalima, odnosno onim što su bili njihovi zakoni, bilo je dakle 35 kanuna. U tih 35 kanuna bilo je vrlo precizno obilježeno kako može da se obnovi stara ruševna crkva ili kako u najboljem slučaju može da se napravi nova. Nikako. Jer je zamršeni sistem korupcije koji je u zakonu postojao i koji je zapravo imao svoj kafkijanski redoslijed. Dakle, bilo je nemoguće ostvarivati svoja vjerska prava.
The desecration and destruction of churches, ruthless retributions, and harsh living conditions of Christians also caused the migration of this group into neighbouring empires such as Austria-Hungary, which by the end of the 19th century significantly changed the ethnic composition of this area. One of the most acclaimed writers from Bosnia and Herzegovina, Mircea Selimović, was very aware of this change. He was born into a Bosnian Muslim family in Tuzla in 1910, but discovered that his ancestors, who were Serb, converted to Islam to protect their Christian brethren. According to a census at the end of the 15th century, over 99% of Christian families and less than 1% of Muslims lived in the administrative unit of the Bosnian Sanjak, while in the 19th century, the Muslim population represented 38% of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Selimović said, to be a Serb is glorious, but also expensive. And the cost of this violent change of identity was a collective trauma, best described by Serbian Nobel Prize winner Ivo Andrić in his literary work, The Bridge on the Drina. Despite being written centuries after the events it portrays, it vividly and in great detail describes the Ottoman custom called the blood tax, the forceful abduction of male children from their families for conversion to Islam. The children were taken across this very bridge in the town of Visegrad to Istanbul. In his work, Andrić writes, it was already the 6th year since the last collection of this tribute of blood. And so this time, the choice had been easy and rich. The necessary number of healthy, bright, and good-looking lads between 10 and 15 years old had been found without difficulty, even though many parents had hidden their children in the forests, taught them how to appear half-witted, clothed them in rags and let them get filthy, to avoid the aga's choice. Some went so far as to maim their own children, cutting off one of their fingers with an axe. The chosen children were laden onto little Bosnian horses in a long convoy. Those convoys passed through here. I can't even begin to imagine how frightened those young, kidnapped boys were, and how the children's mothers must have felt. A little way behind the last horses in that strange convoy, straggled, dishevelled and exhausted, many parents and relatives of those children who were being carried away forever to a foreign world where they would be circumcised, become Turkish, and, forgetting their faith, their country and their origin, would pass their lives in the ranks of the Janissaries or in some other, higher service of the empire. They were, for the most part, women, mothers, grandmothers and sisters of the stolen children. When they came too close, the aga's horsemen would drive them away with whips, urging their horses at them with loud cries to Allah. After being outvoted by Muslim and Croat MPs on October 15, 1991, Serb MPs gathered 9 days later and constituted the Assembly of the Serbian People in Bosnia and Herzegovina with its seat in Sarajevo. At its first session, a plebiscite was called for November 10, which had the aim of defining the will of the Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina and asking them if they were in favour of remaining in the Yugoslav community or not. More than 1,350,000 Serbs took part in it, and 96% voted to stay in Yugoslavia. This was indeed a desperate attempt by the Serb political elite to maintain political visibility and try to prevent a new demographic decline due to a potential loss of political rights. The Assembly of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which operated without Serb representatives after October 15, 1991, scheduled its own referendum for February 29, 1992, in which its citizens would be asked if they were in favour of an independent Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, Serbs boycotted the referendum, aware that their participation would give legitimacy to a system of outvoting rather than reaching a consensus. The referendum was held on February 29th and March 1st, 1992. Sure enough, over 99% of those who voted to leave Yugoslavia. Serbs, meanwhile, organised themselves politically in municipalities where they had a significant majority, wanting to articulate their political interests expressed in the 1991 plebiscite. The Muslims and Croats thus had a political platform, but the Serbs posed an obstacle of sorts. The Serbs possessed significant properties, influence and positions throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they were interwoven with the Muslim and Croat communities to the extent that no de facto unitary government could be established. That obstacle could only be removed through war, and the pretext came faster than anyone expected. One shot articulated all the political violence that the Muslim and Croatian side had been committing for a year. On March 1st, 1992, as the voting on the referendum was still ongoing, Ramiz Delalić Telo, who was previously convicted for violence, fired shots at a Serb wedding in Sarajevo. He killed the father of the groom, Nikola Gardović, as the wedding guests were departing to the old Orthodox church for the wedding ceremony. The reason was, as the executor said himself,
Neke su zastave njihove srpske izvadili iz auta, počeli da mašu njime.
The same Serbian flag that was banned by the Austro-Hungarian government less than a century ago. Nikola Gardović was killed only because he was open about being a Serb. As no one was convicted or even arrested for the crime, the killing of Serbs was essentially legalised. This crime is considered the beginning of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Muslim side denies this, but the fact remains that the executor, Ramiz Delalić, as a member of the Muslims' military forces, was decorated by Alija Izetbegović in person in the war that engulfed the country. The killing was the long-awaited excuse to implement the ideology of the Islamic Declaration, as demonstrated in the days, months and years after the murder. The division into small and big nations cannot be merely determined by counting how many people are a part of a nation, but rather according to the contribution a nation makes to civilization. And when it comes to the Serbian nation, they often gave the most valuable thing they could: life. At the end of the 19th century, the Serbs of this area initiated uprisings and wars against the Ottoman occupiers in the Balkans. From this spot, not far from the town of Nevesinje, the Serbs rebelled in their desire to rid themselves of the now renegade Ottoman authorities, and they freed themselves from the occupier. But this occupier was instantly replaced by another one. At the moment when the Austro-Hungarian occupier was taking control over Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbs made up 43% of the population there and were the single largest ethnic group. This didn't suit the new Austro-Hungarian occupier, so the ethnic composition was to be adjusted in a two-step process. 1, changing the national structure, and 2, controlling inter-ethnic relations. Already in the first years of Austro-Hungarian rule, migrants were brought in, mostly from Bavaria, but from other parts of the empire as well. The first migrant colony near Banja Luka was Windhorst. They were nicknamed Kuferashi, loosely translated to foreigners who only brought a suitcase with them. The exact number of the Kuferashi was never precisely determined, but estimates go as high as 200,000 migrating in 2 decades. Their main role was to take over jobs in the developing industry. Up to 60% of civil service jobs were reserved for the Kuferashi. In addition to migrating peoples to colonies such as Franz Josefsfeld, not far from the city of Bijeljina, where I'm standing, the Austro-Hungarians manipulated the existing ethnic relations in an attempt to control them. Beni Kalai was an Austro-Hungarian statesman who, as administrator of the condominium of Bosnia and Herzegovina, believed he could strengthen Austria-Hungary's authority there by weakening national movements. He first tried to create a unified Bosnian nation, using the word Bošnjak or Bosniak to describe all the inhabitants of Bosnia. Significant funds were invested in this project. Even a newspaper called Bošnjak was printed. But this idea was rejected by Muslims, as well as Serbs and Croats. As this project failed, another one was launched to turn Bosnian Muslims into a separate nation. The works of literature that were devised as a part of that project talked about Serbian Cyrillic writings as a special alphabet called Bosančica. The Bogomils suddenly became a part of the so-called Bosnian Church, while the medieval Stetak tombstones were classified as supposed remnants of that church. Travnik is the birthplace of Ivo Andrić. In his novel, Chronicle of Travnik, or Bosnian Chronicle, he describes the impact on national relations when the government, when it comes to existential issues, favours one national group in relation to the others. Andrić presents the French and Austrian consuls who were sent to Travnik as the embodiment of the great European powers' influence on this area. According to the origin of the consul, a certain nation rejoices, convinced that its political, ideological, or religious resemblance to the consul will give it an existential advantage over other nations. Andrić's message that consuls and everything they represent come and go, but neighbours stay, was never clear enough to the people from this area. The hatred that the Austro-Hungarian government created using the same social mechanisms that Andrić skillfully recognised in his novel left a disastrous legacy. The modern European coloniser emphasised in every way the sublime culture it brings to a dark post-Ottoman realm. However, the incitement of hatred came equally from the Ottoman canopies as it did from the European courts. The people of Bosnia and Herzegovina couldn't fully grasp how the Austro-Hungarian conquerors saw them in 1878, but the press testifies to that. They were seen as savages, animals, linking them to pigs, a Muslim, Serb, and Croat squashed like bugs. Absurdity is best answered with absurdity, and that answer was best articulated by somebody who was educated in the capital of Austria, Petar Kocic. Petar Kocic was a Serbian poet, writer, and politician at the turn of the 20th century. After returning home from his studies in Vienna, he began his political struggle in Sarajevo to improve the conditions of serfs as the lowest class and the general living condition of Serbs. For this, he was sentenced to prison and persecuted. And in his most successful short story, The Badger on Trial, he described the Austro-Hungarian judiciary, which, according to him, has a law for everyone, even a badger. The Badger on Trial talks about the attitude of the Austro-Hungarian government towards Serbs. Based on a true story, the main character is the unassuming David, a Serb farmer who wants to sue a badger for damaging his crops.
Standing before the judges, David talks about his hardships under the occupation through satire. He says that now that he's deprived of everything, he's finally free and happy, although hungry. The judges accept everything, satisfied that David isn't blaming the state for his demise.
The literary work subjects the Austrian authorities to ridicule, but defiantly attacks them as well.
For many, the assassination in Sarajevo served to finally turn their anti-Serbian thoughts into action. Immediately following the assassination, demonstrators demolished the Hotel Evropa simply because it was owned by a Serb. Numerous Serb houses were obliterated. The offices of the Serbian Word newspaper and many other Serbian-owned businesses were attacked. The crowd chanted, "Down with the Serbs," and the abolition of Serbian schools was demanded.
The true face of the Austro-Hungarian occupier was not only reflected in the destruction of property, but also in the prohibition of everything Serbian: their flag, Cyrillic script, and the celebration of their patron saint.
The first Allied victory of World War I was won by the Kingdom of Serbia's army. Sadly, however, this initial success in no way foreshadowed the immense sacrifice the war would demand of the Serbs.
Austria-Hungary eventually managed to occupy Serbia, and Serbia's entire army and government retreated to the Mediterranean. With this, the Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina lost the support they had in Serbia, and the occupier had no more obstacles in dealing with them in a cruel way.
What the Oriental conqueror didn't even think about doing to Serbs for 4 centuries was done by the enlightened conqueror from the West. Concentration camps for Serbs, like the one in Doboj, were a hint of what awaited all of Europe only a few decades later.
It has not been fully determined how many Serbs died in the Doboj concentration camp, but it's estimated that in 1916 alone, over 600 children under the age of 10 died in that camp. And in 1917, 1,000 children died. In addition to the camp, an auxiliary volunteer militia group was established known as the Schutzkorps, composed of Croats and Muslims who hunted down Serbs, mostly civilians, and committed robberies and crimes against them. The Turkish Sultan, as a religious authority, also encouraged hatred by calling Serbs enemies of Islam in a fatwa.
The cemetery of Serbian soldiers near Thessaloniki in Greece is called Zeytinlik, after the olive trees that once grew here. Cemeteries such as this, all over the Mediterranean, testify to the profound sacrifice made by a small kingdom in a fight against a 10 times larger empire.
In 1917 and 1918, the Kingdom of Serbia made an enormous contribution to Allied victory in World War I. However, in this conflict, 3 out of every 10 citizens of Serbia lost their lives.
As the victorious power that militarily controlled all of what we know today as Yugoslavia, Serbia had the chance to create a greater Serbia, but its government decided not to do so, opting instead to unite with its neighbouring nations.
The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes was being created, which soon became the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, without any national characteristics, both in terms of organisation and politics.
World War I brought 4 years of death and destruction to Europe. However, according to the good soldier Schweik, all that could easily have been avoided if only Franz Ferdinand was fat, because then he would have died earlier, of a heart attack.
Schweik, the good-humoured, simple-minded soldier who pretends to be enthusiastic to serve Austria-Hungary in World War I, is a character from a satirical dark comedy novel by a Czech writer who, as a contemporary of World War I, conveyed a message of peace.
This message was recognised by the famous Serbian director, writer and intellectual born in Sarajevo, Emir Kusturica, during the construction of the Andrićgrad project in the city of Visegrad. The purpose of the complex itself is to gather the memory of all the Serbian cultural greats in one place, and it is named after the only Serbian Nobel laureate, Ivo Andrić. On January 9th, 1992, at the Sarajevo Holiday Inn, the Republic of the Serb people of Bosnia and Herzegovina was proclaimed. The Serbs had this historical memory that whenever they lost their political significance and connection to Serbia, they were exposed to persecution. Radovan Karadžić became the first president, and Momčilo Krajišnik the president of the assembly. Apart from the constitution and political organisation, Republika Srpska did not have an army, as the politicians were convinced that the Yugoslav People's Army, or JNA, would preserve peace, and that a solution to the crisis would be found politically. However, events in May of 1992, such as the attack on a column of retreating JNA soldiers in Dobrovoljačka Street in Sarajevo, and in Tuzla just 2 weeks later, clearly showed why the Muslim side organised their armed forces as early as May 1991 to wage war with the Serbs. As the JNA withdrew from Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Serbs were left without protection, and that is why they formed the Army of Republika Srpska in the spring of 1992. The Serbs were fearful of a repeat of their experiences of bearing the brunt of fascism and Nazism, the prevailing political ideologies of Germany and Italy in the 1930s. Now, these ideologies supposedly promoted peace to the outside world, but carried out terror at home. With the rise of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party to power in Germany, the ideology that Germans were a higher race of people and their claim to the territories of other nations opened the door to a new war in Europe. The revolt of the Serbian people against these morally distorted ideas was perhaps best described by the words of Branko Ćopić, a contemporary of World War II. I watched our singing youths fight and die for the freedom of their homeland, to save humanity from fascist darkness and slavery. Branko Ćopić, born in what is today Republika Srpska, was a writer, satirist, but also a participant in the anti-fascist struggle of the partisans. His participation in the war significantly marked his literary work, but his cheerful spirit will be remembered through the works he wrote for children. The deadly darkness of World War II soon engulfed the Balkans, bringing with it a chapter of history that's not so difficult to understand as it is difficult to comprehend how it could possibly have been written by human beings. Never again. This was the cry heard from Serbs in Bosnia and Herzegovina in early 1992. Those two words spoke of an entire century of tragic experiences. Donja Gradina was part of the Jasenovac concentration camp complex, which testifies to the genocide committed against civilians during World War II in the former Kingdom of Yugoslavia. With the invasion of Nazi Germany in April 1941, Yugoslavia was conquered and divided into occupation zones. The so-called independent state of Croatia, a Nazi puppet state, was formed on the territories roughly corresponding to today's Croatia, combined with Bosnia and Herzegovina and parts of Serbia and Slovenia. Its leader and political creator was Ante Pavelić, whose ideology was in line with Nazi Germany's regarding Jews, Roma and communists, but was, in addition, extremely hostile towards Serbs. The real face of the enlightened colonisers who came to this area has never been easily visible, but it has always been subtly implemented in the most important aspects of life. Austria-Hungary, in their construction of schools in what they saw as a backwards Bosnia and Herzegovina, can boast of the product of their education system, Ante Pavelić, the leader of the later formed fascist Croatian Ustaša movement and the independent state of Croatia. Historians have a well-founded suspicion that it was at the Travnik Gymnasium that Pavelić accepted the anti-Serbian teachings of the Croatian nationalist ideologue Ante Starčević. The goal of physically reducing the number of Serbs, thus extinguishing their political significance, remained the same during World War II as it was during the Austro-Hungarian occupation. So, the Ustaše applied the same recipe that was used in Doboj 27 years earlier, forming concentration camps.
In addition to banning the national symbols of Serbs, identical to measures during the Austro-Hungarian occupation, the Jasenovac concentration camp complex was formed, in which the Ustaše rounded up Serbs, Jews, Roma, communists and others. Known for their cruelty, these camps even interned children. Although hundreds of thousands were killed, the final number of victims has never been fully determined.
The question is, why did all the conquerors of the past see Serbs as the enemy? Well, because whenever Serbs were threatened by an incomparably greater force, they mostly resisted.
Borba za slobodu je ključna. Ona je u suštini kulturološke prirode. Jer frfljatori, oni nemaju zamjenu za ovo. Oni samo govore, oni su nacionalisti, oni pokušavaju da odbrane nešto što je neodbranjivo. A šta je njihova kontrateža? Hoće da nam otmu sve što imamo, ne samo oduzmu kulturu, nego i žene, i kola, i kuće, i stanove, da budu vlasnici, a da mi budemo korisnici. E pa neće moći.
No way. The first in Europe who said this to the largest military power of the 20th century, Nazi Germany, were the Serbs, right here in Nevesinje.
When the Serbs saw the genocidal system of concentration camps and the indiscriminate killings that were taking place there, they decided to rise up and take action. An insurgency was quickly organised in this area that had a history of rebellion.
As early as June 23rd and 24th, 1941, the entire municipality of Nevesinje, except for two major military strongholds, was liberated.
The first military victories of the Soviet Union, the United States and Great Britain over Germany happened several years later.
For the Nazis and the Ustaše, however, one man was their biggest headache. They described him as the most dangerous rebel leader because he is the most intelligent, leads the largest and strongest group of insurgents, is very careful and carries out his attacks with systematic precision. He was Mladen Stojanovic, the legendary Dr. Mladen, leader of the partisan insurgents in Kozara.
The life story of this son of a priest, a member of the Young Bosnia movement, a poet, tennis player, doctor and national hero is one of the most exciting in the turbulent and tragic history here. In his youth, he met with Gavrilo Princip and other freedom fighters in this area. He conspired against the occupiers, was arrested by the Austro-Hungarian authorities, treated hundreds of Krajina peasants for free and gave money for medicine and travel expenses to the poor.
At times, his life was reminiscent of that of Cuban revolutionary Che Guevara. But people around the world don't wear t-shirts with the image of Dr. Mladen, although they really should.
After the German attack on Yugoslavia, Dr. Mladen was arrested, but he managed to escape from prison and flee to Kozara, where he became the commander of the Kozara partisan detachment.
Dr. Mladen's group engaged in heroic combat against the occupiers and the Ustaše. Several offensives were launched against him, none were successful. The legendary Dr. Mladen managed to stay on Kozara and continue carrying out military operations. Because of his wise and uncompromising fight for freedom, he became the most popular figure amongst people living in this region.
While trying to unite as many people as possible for the struggle, he was ambushed and shot in the forehead. Incredibly, he survived the severe injury and began to recover successfully. But there was another betrayal from within his ranks, and Dr. Mladen was killed.
It was a tremendous blow to the Serbs, who made up 90% of the partisan forces in this area. Only a few months later, Nazi Germany and the Ustaše launched an offensive against the partisan movement.
The Battle of Kozara took over 30,000 civilian lives, largely Serbs, most of whom were killed at the Jasenovac concentration camp.
The Kozara Memorial Park is one of many throughout Republika Srpska that attests to the heroic struggle for freedom of the largest resistance movement in Europe during World War II. 1990s, the interference of Western powers in the Yugoslav conflict was supposed to be a guarantee that the horrors of World War II would not be repeated and that disagreements would be resolved peacefully. Instead, Western powers clearly began taking sides in the conflict.
Germany heavily lobbied the Council of Ministers of the European Community to recognise the independence of Croatia in 1991, despite the disenfranchisement of Serbs living there. And the same lobbying continued for the recognition of the independence of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1992. The appeals of the politically disenfranchised Serbs there did not yield significant results. Warnings of the return of Nazism in these areas, as seen in Vox magazine, didn't change the West's perception of the tensions in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
The Austro-Hungarian occupation provided a template for turning ethnic groups against each other, and this is how it was done.
Muslims, Serbs and Croats lived together in peace for centuries. Their culture, language, history and personal lives often intertwined. So, certain individuals from those groups were chosen by the occupier to sow hatred and exploit religious feelings. In World War I, this was done by creating the Schutzkorps, composed of members of two nations who persecuted and killed members of the third nation. In World War II, a Nazi SS unit called the Handjar Division was formed, made up of Muslims, whose religious sentiments were exploited by Nazi Germany, which in turn supported the Ustaše movement led by Ante Pavelić in its genocide of Serbs. Thus, in the 1990s, certain Western powers supported Alija Izetbegović, despite him being convicted of religious fanaticism.
A speech by the Serb representative Radovan Karadzic in Bosnia and Herzegovina's parliament in October 1992 was relentlessly replayed on television channels around the world.
Ovo je put na koji vi hoćete da izvedete Bosnu i Hercegovinu, ista ona autostrada pakla i stradanja kojom su pošli Slovenija i Hrvatska. Nemojte da mislite da nećete odvesti Bosnu i Hercegovinu u pakao, a muslimanski narod možda u nestanak. Jer muslimanski narod ne može da se odbrani ako bude rat ovdje.
This was presented as a threat, and out of context, sure, it sounds like one. But was it a warning? If the Serb politician's aim was really to erase all Muslims from Bosnia and Herzegovina, then it certainly made little sense for him to invite Izetbegović to the founding of their political party in 1990 and even let him speak as an honoured guest.
Nismo ni protiv naših muslimana. Mi smo protiv njihove dominacije nad Srbima.
Why would Serbs push for violent change when the status quo of Yugoslavia suited them best, as all Serbs lived in one unified state? Nevertheless, Karadzic's statements were used by many politicians and media outlets around the world as evidence that Serbs wanted war. They ignored the fact that just months before, Karadzic signed the Carrington-Cutigliero peace plan known as the Lisbon Agreement, the last peace deal before the war erupted. The agreement was also signed by the leader of Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Mate Boban, and the Muslim leader, Alija Izetbegović. But then the US ambassador to Yugoslavia, Warren Zimmerman, convinced Izetbegović to withdraw his signature from the peace plan.
By withdrawing his signature, Alija Izetbegović, not through a speech, but through his concrete actions, opened the gates of conflict, with the blessing of the strongest global superpower.
The involvement of the United States and Germany in the events that followed was undisputed.
In fact, the three national groups agreed on a petition, and the United States, under the previous administration, opposed it because they were worried about the precedent it might set for the then Soviet Union.
An international community fanning the flames of war under the banner of peace, embodied in soldiers in white uniforms, was satirized by the surrealists on Yugoslav television.
Što se organizujete malo organizacija, ocijepljenje, to nešto, Dobro, to će biti.
The Western countries openly taking sides was accompanied by a narrative that labelled Serbs as the aggressors.
Shortly after the United States and Western Europe recognized the independence of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serb forces had invaded Bosnia.
All this despite the fact that Serbs have inhabited this area since the early Middle Ages, and that they have been an inalienable factor to all elements of life here ever since. This narrative fit into the propaganda that accompanied the start of all the wars in the Balkans.
Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina always had a reputation across Yugoslavia as good hosts, people who loved a good joke, which they call šega. To push them into a war mentality, their religious feelings were exploited.
Što bi rekao jedan čovjek u Visokom pred rat upravo tih 90. godina, profa, jesi ti ono, šta si ti, jesi ti naš? Pa rekao, dobro, ja sam svačiji, ali kaže, a tvoja ona žena, šta je ona? Pa rekao, ona ti je Jugoslovenka, ona je miksana srpsko-hrvatska, otac Srbin, majka Hrvatica, došli s prugom, buraz. Nije važno koje smo vjere, važno je da smo muslimani.
From the moment the conflict started until the war ended in 1995, images of Sarajevo as a city under siege by well-armed Serbs circulated the world. The circumstances were completely different.
During the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbs wanted to defend the places where they constituted a majority. 180,000 Serbs lived in Sarajevo, so they formed military and police authorities in the Sarajevo municipalities where Serbs made up the majority. The rest of the city's territory was under the control of Muslim forces, the Army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In none of the media reports from war-torn Sarajevo could you read or hear these facts. The number of Serbian troops participating in the fighting around Sarajevo never exceeded 13,000, while the number of Muslim soldiers was several times greater. Throughout the entire war, there was no concrete attempt by Serbs to conquer the city itself. Most of the higher positions around the city were controlled by the Muslim army. Grenades were thrown from Muslim-controlled territories as well as Serb-controlled territories. Both sides conducted military operations, so it wasn't true that only civilians resided in Sarajevo during the war.
But what made the civil war in Bosnia and Herzegovina unjustifiably horrific were the numerous war crimes committed by all sides.
Kravica is one of the many places where mostly Serbs lived. The population in the general area west of the Drina River was a mix of Serbs and Muslims. At the beginning of the war, by invading the Serb majority towns of Kravica and Bratunac, Muslim forces committed horrific crimes in the poorly defended villages of this area. Determined to stop this threat, the army of Republika Srpska launched a military operation in 1993, after which the area of Srebrenica was placed under the protection of UN forces as a safe area and demilitarized zone.
But it wasn't demilitarized, and the Muslim forces continued carrying out their military operations, leading the army of Republika Srpska to decide to take over control of the Srebrenica safe area.
The army of Republika Srpska's entry into Srebrenica in 1995 ignited chaos. Though many civilians were evacuated from the city, many others, including children, were killed by Serb forces. Some Muslim soldiers who were attempting to break through to Tuzla were captured and executed.
There's no justification for such heinous crimes, considered the largest single act of mass killing in the Yugoslav wars and the worst in Europe since World War II. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was established in 1993 in The Hague. Now, the Hague Tribunal was supposed to bring justice to the victims and reconciliation among the nations following the end of the civil wars. However, it would be eerily reminiscent of earlier European courts.
Instead of reconciliation, the Hague Tribunal brought even deeper divisions to this area by choosing to disproportionately punish one side in the conflict. If all the verdicts were added together, Croats, Bosniaks and Albanians were sentenced to a total of about 300 years in prison, while Serbs alone were sentenced to over 1,000 years in prison for crimes in the former Yugoslavia. The verdict of this court that what happened in Srebrenica constituted genocide remains an open topic in some circles to this day.
By politicising the victims of war, it makes it that much harder for one nation to truly understand the suffering and tragedy of another. Understanding not a Bosniak's, nor a Croat's, nor a Serb's pain, but rather a human being's pain would help to bring closure to these dark pages of human history. but most importantly, help prevent something like this from ever happening again here in Bosnia and Herzegovina and also in Croatia. Knin is a city in Croatia where, before the civil war in 1991, Serbs made up 80% of the population. With the conquest of the Ottoman Empire in the 14th century, many Serbs started migrating north to neighbouring Austria. Some of the displaced Serbs settled in the border area, which came to be known as the Vojna Krajina, or military frontier, which acted as the cordon sanitaire against incursions from the Ottoman Empire. After the Ottomans left and Austria-Hungary crumbled, the number of Serbs living in the Krajina region remained significant. After they fell victim to genocide during World War II, the Serbs became a constitutional part of the Socialist Republic of Croatia within Yugoslavia. This meant that important decisions about Croatia were to be made by a consensus between both Croats and Serbs. But in 1991, Serbs were outvoted in a referendum, and Croatia declared Serbs a national minority, thus marginalising their political significance. In the years leading up to the referendum, Serbs and their properties were the target of numerous attacks. In an attempt to preserve their rights and protect themselves, Serbs proclaimed the Republika Srpska Krajina, which had all the elements of statehood. A bloody war was fought until 1995, when the Croatian army launched Operation Storm, a military operation that effectively extinguished the Republika Srpska Krajina and expelled more than 200,000 Serbs from the area. Those fleeing the army had little to no time to take with them what they could, while many who remained in their homes were killed.
Srpska Krajina je bila prst u oku svim hrvatskim politikama koje su se odvijale u posljednjih 200 godina, jer su Srbi koji su čuvali austro-ugarske granice nisu polagali račune kneževima u Hrvatskoj, nego direktno austrijskom dvoru. I mislim da je ta mržnja prema Srbima koja je tamo eskalirala ne samo teoretski, nego i praktično masovnim ubijanjem.
Today, there are 8 times fewer Serbs in Knin than before the war. Almost no Serbs left in practically all areas of Bosnia and Herzegovina that didn't become a part of Republika Srpska. Even in Mostar, the birthplace of one of the greatest Serbian poets, Aleksa Šantić.
There were more than 19,000 Serbian residents here, and now that number's diminished down to about 3,000.
After the signing of the Dayton Peace Agreement in 1995, which ended the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, about 150,000 Serbs left the parts of Sarajevo where they lived in the middle of winter.
ko što biješe divnih dana, po ružama i sad preska bistra vodaša drvana.
Vezam uz tebe što sam im.
Aj, šadrvana, po ružama i sad preska bistra vodaša drvana. Aj, šadrvana.
During this exodus, they even dug out their dead loved ones in fear of their graves being desecrated.
I kad tuga uzdah sprema, moja ljubav pjesmu kreće, što te nema, što te nema, što te nema. Moja ljubav pjesmu kreće, što te nema, što te nema, aj, što te nema.
The Serbs in Republika Srpska knew that if they wanted to remain on their historical land, west of the Drina River, they had to defend themselves, just like their ancestors did. On this spot, Serbs in Nevesinje met with representatives of Western powers urging them to reconsider rebelling against the Ottomans, as Germany and Austria didn't want instability in their border areas.
Despite not having support from the West, or even Serbia, Montenegro or Russia, the Serbs of Nevesinje raised an armed uprising by themselves.
When asked, how will you fight without food or ammunition, one of the rebels took a handful of his land and said, this is my food and ammunition. So as long as we have this, we have the means to fight and something to die for.
The army of Republika Srpska was almost twice as small as the combined Muslim and Croat armies. Despite not exceeding 80,000 fighters, the Serbs controlled a front line that at one point spanned 3,000 kilometres. They sometimes had the support of Serbia, though even Serbia at one point imposed sanctions against Republika Srpska. The international community and Western politicians, as well as mainstream media outlets, were firmly against the Serbs, with NATO even bombing Serb positions in Republika Srpska in 1995. Yet despite all of this, the army of Republika Srpska resisted and defended their homes just like their ancestors did.
The strong resistance of the Serb soldiers was all a part of the same heroism that Jovan Dučić recognised.
Jovan Dučić was a Serb writer and diplomat at the turn of the 20th century, born in Trebinje in Herzegovina. In writing about heroism, he says that Serbs are the only people whose hero ideal is similar to the ancient one, as someone who sacrifices himself for the good of others.
The heroes of the Battle of Kosovo against the Ottomans in the 14th century, Miloš Obilić and Prince Lazar, as well as the entire Serbian army, knowingly gave their lives for freedom and what that freedom represents. Under the Ottoman occupation, the heroes were called Hajduks, outlaws who took from rich Ottomans and gave to the poor, risking their own lives for freedom. The heroes of the first Serbian uprising against the Ottomans at the beginning of the 19th century weren't noblemen. They were simply those who fought to liberate their people through courage and sacrifice.
Despite terrible conditions, faced with attacks from all sides, the fighters of the army of Republika Srpska managed to preserve the territory where Serbs live in Bosnia and Herzegovina during 3 years of war.
show continuity with their compatriots and ancestors who gave their lives for the same struggle in World War I and were buried in Zetinlik in Greece, this place of eternal rest for the soldiers of the army of Republika Srpska in Sokolac near Sarajevo was named Mali Zetinlik, or Small Zetinlik.
For the first time in centuries, Serbs west of the Drina River have all the mechanisms to shape and organise their own lives. Republika Srpska covers around half of Bosnia and Herzegovina and has all the elements of statehood. It has its own government, assembly, president, police, but also the ability to influence the political course of Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Therefore, Republika Srpska isn't just a political entity, it's the necessary minimum for Serbs to survive in a land where they've always lived.
The Principality of Serbia was the first country, aside from France, to abolish feudalism, and the only one that didn't have nobility in Europe. Everyone was equal. In the 2 world wars, the Serbs made enormous sacrifices, with the most per capita deaths in the Great War.
This willingness to sacrifice everything for freedom is due to the Serbs' unique attitude towards freedom, which means to be one's own, and brings with it the cultural paradigm that everyone must be free, and thus equal.
That is why Serbs have always been a thorn in the eye of many colonisers and occupiers, and they still are today. As long as a Serb exists, he or she has a spiritual duty to fight slavery and inequality in every way.
Republika Srpska wasn't planned. It's a consequence of the Serb struggle for freedom. And the pledge that it will always exist is at the heart of what it means to be a Serb.
Srbi znači biti slobodan, a to je ono što smeta drugima, a biti slobodan znači biti dovoljno jak da budeš slobodan i živjeti u jednoj katarzičnoj istoriji u kojoj nisi dozvoljavao da budeš poražen. To je narod koji u svojoj istoriji nikad do kraja nije bio poražen. Nije bio poražen za vrijeme Turske, kada je živa aktivnost između Srpske i Ruske crkve postojala u 16. vijeku, do oslobađanja i do stvaranja uslova za sve druge narode koji su tu živjeli, kako god se oni zvali, a to je bio prvi srpski ustanak ili prva srpska revolucija, u kojoj je Karađorđe u stvari obezbijedio svim drugim narodima da polako krenu u ono što danas jesu. Dakle, biti nepokoren je uslov za biti slobodan. I to je za mene srpski narod.
As Serb poet Alex Ashantić wrote, "We know our fate and all we're in for. Oh, yet our hearts in fright will not shiver. Oxen bow down, but men do not quiver. For God, unto men, freedom did bestow."